fightpicks.com, going over my picks for Randamie versus Ladd, UFC Fight Night. Interesting card. No real stars outside of Uriah Faber. And I've said before many, many times, whenever you get this kind of card where there aren't a lot of big names, it's almost pick 'em in every single fight. Simply because everybody's fighting for a spot. There aren't a lot of history behind a lot of the fighters. So it's who brings it best that particular night. And whenever have that happening, it's always tough making picks. But there are going to be some entertaining fights. A lot of people are sleeping on this card. I think it's going to be a good one personally. So let's start out. Fightpicks.com. Use the promo code jimmysmith, all one word. Start at the bottom, main card. Cesar Fajita versus Martin Vittori. I called Cesar Fajita's fight in Argentina against Ian Heinisch. And Ian Heinisch is a real physical talent, but it was stylistically a tough one for Cesar Fajita in that Ian Heinisch is a great wrestler, has great submission defense, and just gets better as fights go along. And he started out strong, but couldn't finish strong. That's what led him to loss against Ian Heinisch. But this is a guy with fantastic jiu-jitsu, submission win over Jack Hermanson, win over Nate Marquardt, decision over Anthony Smith. He's beaten some really top-level guys. Very high quality, almost always based on his submission ability. The one problem he's had is his ability to pace fights properly. We saw it against Ian Heinisch. We saw it against Elias Theodorou, in that Elias Theodorou paces fights his own way, and Cesar Fajita couldn't overcome that. Also against Ian Heinisch, started out strong, couldn't finish strong, and that allowed Ian Heinisch. Judges tend to remember what happens at the end of rounds. They tend to reward fighters for finishing strong rather than starting strong, and that was the problem with Cesar Fajita throughout that fight. So really talented, very strong, big guy for the weight class, but has had trouble a little bit with his pacing in previous fights. I like Martin Vittori as a fighter as well. He's a well-rounded guy, less of a specialist than Fajita. When you have 12 wins, 8 by submission, 2 by knockout, a submission guy in his own right, but not on the level of Cesar Fajita. Fajita just has the better ground game. That's partly why. And this is a guy went to the distance with Israel Adesanya, Antonio Carlos Jr. No big names on his resume yet outside of Israel Adesanya. So we're not sure how he does against great fighters who also, in my opinion, have an advantage where he's good. He's not as much of a specialist as Fajita, but he's more of a submission guy. But Fajita has the better ground game. So I'm going Cesar Fajita. I think it's a ground battle. Let's go submission late, third round. So Cesar Fajita versus Martin Vittori, I think it's a submission late. Carl Robertson versus Wellington Turman. Now the problem here is only Robertson has UFC experience. That's always a huge X factor. When I talk about cards like this being X factors, one of the X factors in these cards is up-and-comer who's been successful at the regional level, the feeder level, or whatever you want to call it, making their bump to the UFC, taking on a veteran who is good, not great, who's had some success but hasn't really established themselves. That's kind of the toss-up fight. And the one on this card is Carl Robertson versus Wellington Turman. Now, Robertson, 7 wins, 2 by knockout, 3 submissions, 2 decisions, so he's been all over the place. His only losses, Cesar Fajita and Glover Teixeira, 2 very, very tough fighters. And the way he's lost has been by submission. Now, the thing is about Turman making his UFC debut, isn't really a submission guy. That's not exactly where he's made his bones. And also, Glover Teixeira and Cesar Fajita, if you're going to lose to somebody by submission, those are 2 good guys to lose to. Not only is Glover Teixeira a knockout puncher, when he's on top, very basic pressure game jiu-jitsu, and the same thing with Cesar Fajita. So not only 2 submission guys, 2 guys with kind of that step-by-step kind of game that I personally like, because I'm old. But that's what we're seeing, is a guy bumping up into the main card, taking on a guy with UFC experience who isn't exactly tearing it up, 2-2 in the UFC, but Glover Teixeira, who's very experienced, and Cesar Fajita, who's an up-and-comer. So 2 good names. One very good, fought for a title. So my pick here, generally in this kind of situation, I'm going with a guy with experience. I'm going with Robertson, probably by decision. I think his UFC experience is a little too much. Josh Emmett, Mirsad Becktick. Now, one thing to keep in mind with Mirsad Becktick is this is a guy the UFC was really, really hyped on until I don't know if comeback is a strong enough word, against Darren Elkins. Darren Elkins pulled a zombie move, raised himself up from the dead, and won that fight. Becktick was just destroying him the entire fight. He's versatile. He's strong. He's confident. He's aggressive. Mirsad Becktick is a guy, I thought sky was kind of the limit for him. And then Darren Elkins set him back a little bit. Came back with 2 wins after that. The biggest name was the Ricardo Lamas fight. I called that one in Chicago. I thought he clearly, it was a close fight, but I thought he beat Ricardo Lamas. I think the judges got it right on that one. But there's not a lot he can't do on the feet. Now, that contrasts to me with Josh Emmett, who we remember a lot of times the knockouts. We remember the big punch. We remember what he did to 2 opponents, actually, Ricardo Lamas and Michael Johnson, are the ones we really remember. Ricardo Lamas, man, just decapitated him with a shot. Remember, he didn't make weight in that one, so he had a little bit of a size advantage. Michael Johnson, once again, knocked him out. But the Michael Johnson fight was pretty boring up until the knockout. This is a guy, 14 wins, generally wins by decision. That's how he's won half of his fights. It's not, we remember the big finishes, but he doesn't get those that often. Before that, his last knockout was in 2016. So Josh Emmett is heavy-handed. If he lays one on you, he can knock you out. I also like what I saw coming back from the Jeremy Stephens, which was a decapitation. That was a brutal knockout, if you guys remember that one. So brutal, and comes back, knocks out Michael Johnson. So I like his guts, I like his heart. But he's pretty much an overhand right, knock you out kind of guy.